We are living in, just please come in, we are living in very, very interesting times. And this is not the first time that we lived in interesting times. And if one would think of someone who has written the history of the present, who has reflected about Europe, who has not only analyzed it, but through his writing has shaped Europe in various stages, there's no one better than Professor Timothy Garton Ash. And it would be very easy in every single university of our 18 members to say, if you want the one who understands Europe and the current and the last 30 years, who would you nominate? And 18 member universities would say Professor Timothy Garton Ash. So sometimes it's very hard for us to plan a program, sometimes it's very easy. And we know that Professor Timothy Garton Ash is in Oxford, but he is a global public intellectual representing as a voice of Europe the best that Europe can offer. And not only the best that Europe can offer, because those who were with Danny last night, the head of Oxfam World, said if you have talent, you have to bring it to the public good and you have to become a public intellectual. Timothy Garton Ash is a writer. He has written about the Polish Revolution. He has written The Magic Lantern about the 1989 revolution. In his book on German foreign policy and Germany in Europe is still the reference point, and the analysis is still very strong there. He has written personal histories, the file, his personal experiences. He has written about essays on the first decade, the decade with no name. He has written a book on free speech and on the free world. But what distinguishes, in addition to this historical analysis, he is a columnist in The Guardian all the time, and his columns make a difference. When the federal president of Germany, Steinmeier, celebrated the 30th anniversary of unification, he referred to one of Tim's writings. And Tim said, basically, the last 30 years was a belle epoque, and the next 30 years will be much harder. And this was in a few years ago, and no one could predict how hard it would be, but that there was a sense that the 30 years that we had experienced are different from what we experienced was quite obvious. And it's a reference to Tim's commitment to public life that people of that caliber refer to Timothy Garton Ash. And because he is the figure that he has won many, many prizes. I can't list the prizes, but it's obviously the most prestigious one is the Charlemagne Prize, where the most committed Europeans get that special prize, in addition to the Order of Merit of Germany, of Poland, of Czechoslovakia. So we are extremely grateful to have our colleague and friend Timothy Garton Ash addressing us on the 30th anniversary of the Europaeum, and it's my pleasure to welcome our friend Timothy Garton Ash. Tim, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Hartmut, for that extremely kind introduction. And thank you all for your 18 votes, which Hartmut has single-handedly given me. It's a great pleasure to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Europaeum with you, Europaeum trustees, faculty, staff, current scholars, but perhaps particularly the alumni, both here and around the world. The Europaeum is a part of the history I want to talk about. As Ursula von der Leyen indicated, it is born in that moment of extraordinary optimism at the birth of what I call post-wall Europe, the Europe that emerges after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe, German unification, the end of the Cold War, and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. You can hear in the background of the birth of the Europaeum the Italian winner of the Eurovision Song Contest in 1990, Insieme 1992, with its catchy, if rather cheesy, chorus, Insieme, Unite, Unite Europe. We're hearing a rather different tune from Italy today. We've gone from Insieme, Unite, Unite Europe to Giorgia Meloni, Dio, Patria, Familia, God, Homeland and Family, to Silvio Berlusconi, telling us that all Vladimir Putin wanted to do in Ukraine was to install some decent people in the government in Kiev. From the end of the Cold War to the largest hot war in Europe since 1945. And what I want to do with you in the next 35 to 40 minutes is to give you just the bare bones of an interpretation that I advance in much more depth and granularity in my new book, Homelands: A Personal History of Europe, which is in conversation with a book that most of you will know, Tony Judd's great book on the history of Europe from 1945 until the early 2000s, post-war. And post-war, the title, actually has a double meaning. It has an obvious meaning, which is after the war, after the Second World War, and a somewhat more hidden meaning, which is after war. That is to say, the story of a Europe which, under the motto "never again," set out never again to be a continent of wars, to be a continent of peace. Now, those of you who have read Professor Kiran Klaus Patel, who's with us here today, wonderful book on the early years of European integration, will know that the true history of the early years of European integration is much more complicated than simply a peace project. But it was also a peace project. But it would have been news to people, many people around the world, that this Europe after 1945 had abhorred and abjured war. It would have been news to people in French Indochina, in Kenya, in Algeria, in Angola, in Mozambique, in all those places where those West European states which were proclaiming the advent of peace in Europe were fighting campaigns of repression and fierce colonial war to defend their colonies. Let me remind you, into the mid-1970s. Angola and Mozambique only get their independence in the mid-1970s. It would also have been news to many East Europeans who had experienced the Soviet invasion of Hungary, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, what in Poland was called stan wojenny, literally a state of war in 1981, and so on. And of course, Europe was still a highly militarized continent on a nuclear trigger. So that actually, in a sense, the real Europe of peace, the post-war, comes after 1989. I will never forget walking up a street in East Berlin immediately after the Berlin Wall came down, and a very excited East Berliner came towards me and he said, "I've just seen a handwritten poster which said, 'Only today is the war really over.'" And there is a real sense in which that was true for the whole of the Europe that had been behind the Iron Curtain. Only today is the war really over. For Eastern Europe, 89 was the second year zero. We then had the peace settlement that we had not had in 1945, came about in 1991. The treaties on German unification, the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, the Polish-German Treaty, and so on, explicitly refer back to the lacking peace settlement in 1945. And we had just seen the last major European empire, the Soviet-Russian Empire, softly and suddenly vanish away. So a new era of peace was dawning. And to this objective geopolitical story, I want to add a generational subjective story. So one way to tell the history of Europe since 1945 is in terms of a series of key political generations. The 14ers, shaped by the youthful experience of the First World War. The 39ers, shaped by youthful experience of the Second World War. The 68ers, shaped by youthful experience of 68. And the 89ers, shaped by the experience of 89. Those first two generations, the 14ers, the generation of Churchill, de Gaulle, Adenauer, started the peace project which the 39ers carried on. But it was the 68ers who actually became the dominant political generation in Europe after 1989, who carried it forward to its greatest extent, who took the peace dividend, reducing our military spending well below the NATO target of 2% of GDP, who asserted that security was now to be found in new ways. There would never again be an interstate land war in Europe, surely not. and asserted the primacy of economic policy, and that, of course, interdependence, economic interdependence, for example, in energy in relations with Russia, would itself secure peace. It was a new version of Immanuel Kant's project towards perpetual peace, and we neglected to notice an old Russian proverb which said and says, perpetual peace lasts until the next war. Now, underlying this story was what I would call a historiosophical mistake. The mistake was to take what happened in 1989 and 91 and in the 90s and to extrapolate, to believe that this was the way history was going. To take history with a small h and turn it into history with a capital H, in the sense of Hegel. Not just a struggle, but a process of growth in the consciousness of freedom and the spread of freedom. Something which had a character of historical inevitability. Whereas, of course, the truth is that what happened in the transition from post-war to post-war Europe was a 1 in a million example of historical luck, of what Machiavelli called fortuna. It was a quite exceptional lining up of circumstances. Of course, there were deeper structural factors, but if you look at what I call the upward turn in European history, which begins roughly around 1985 and then becomes apparent in 1989, you see the convergence of 4 major strands of historical development which have entirely different roots. First of all, of course, the emergence of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev as leader of the Soviet Union on the 11th of March, 1985. The system whose ideology asserted the unimportance of the individual in history proved the importance of the individual in history. Separately, in Eastern Europe, you have people like Václav Havel and Bronislaw Geremek and the opposition movements developing new political strategies in which you can have evolutionary change of a Soviet-type system towards democracy, step by step, and people inside the communist regimes who were prepared to enter that conversation. So you had the ground prepared for negotiated revolutions, for negotiated transition, so that when the amber light comes from Gorbachev, the East Europeans drive straight through it and treat it as a green light. Separately, again, you have in Western Europe a great dynamic period of European integration, symbolized by the project of 1992, to which Insieme in 1992 refers, i.e. the single market, driven forward by another exceptional individual, Jacques Delors. We have Pascal Lamy with us here, who can tell us all about that period. I would add that this was one of the few periods, I would say 2 periods, where Britain actually played a really constructive part in the story of European integration after 1984, the Fontainebleau summit, in pushing forward the project of the single market. Separately, again, you have developments in the United States, where after the deep depression of the 1970s, it is, in Reagan's famous slogan, morning again in America. It's morning in America. You have a tremendous sense of economic and technological dynamism. The internet is just being invented. And you have the phenomenon of Reagan, again, the individual in history, with his really remarkable turn from the arms race of his first term to the radical disarmament and détente of his second term. All these elements were essential to take us to 1989. Each came from a different place, but serendipitously combined in 1989, when, of course, even on the 9th of November 1989, as we all know, confusion and miscommunication were actually the handmaidens of liberation. There was nothing inevitable about how the fall of the wall happened. But then, over the years, as I said, people began to regard this as normality. as part of a historical process, freedom not as a struggle, but as a process. And this was particularly true of the 89ers, those who were formed by their youthful experience of 1989, who naturally tended to see 1989 in other developments around the world. A good example is how people read the Arab Spring, as if it was going to be another 1989. Now, I want just to pause for a moment to say that these illusions are often wrongly, in my view, attributed to the beginning of the 1990s. And poor old Francis Fukuyama gets it in the neck with his End of History, quite unfairly, by the way. Actually, in the 1990s, early 1990s, we had no idea if these transitions were going to succeed. Not in Eastern Europe, where the joke was, we know you can turn an aquarium into fish soup, but can you turn fish soup back into an aquarium? Not in Western Europe, where the big projects, apart from the single market, above all, of course, the monetary union, but also enlargement, were still, and Schengen was still to be done. And of course, we had 5 wars in former Yugoslavia. So it is not the case that this sort of period of hubris was there in the early 1990s. There was liberal triumphalism to be sure, but then it was a liberal triumph. In my view, the hubris comes later. It comes in the early to mid 2000s, when everything seemed to have gone so well. We'd done the enlargement of the EU and NATO. We'd done the transitions to democracy. The euro seemed to be going so well. The UK under Tony Blair seemed to be quite happy in the European Union. Remember that, anyone? We were going to have a European constitution. There was an orange revolution in Ukraine which suggested that the forward march of democracy would continue. And it's at precisely this moment that our old friend hubris sets in. The hubris of the United States, believing that since it was the hyperpower, Prometheus unbound, the new Rome, it could just march into Iraq and create a new democracy. The hubris of Blair's Cool Britannia, the hubris of some of my friends in East Central Europe who believed that Poland and Hungary were already consolidated democracies, nothing to worry about. The hubris of the belief that we could continue ever further with the enlargement of NATO and the EU without a violent reaction from Russia. The hubris of believing that the euro was going magnificently well. I refer you to Jean-Claude Trichet's speech on the 10th anniversary of the European Central Bank in 2008. Not entirely seeing what was going on under the surface. And of course, the hubris of a globalized, financialized capitalism, which believed that it was sweeping all before it, which, in the words of Gordon Brown, had put an end to boom and bust, which believed that free markets were some kind of universal panacea, that global aggregate gains could not just justify, but actually compensate for local social and economic losses, which, as we found out subsequently, was a big mistake, and of course, unprecedented levels of inequality. So then we come to what I call in my book the downward turn. If the upward turn begins roughly in 1985 and becomes evident in 1989, I would say the downward turn begins somewhere around 2005. Think the terrorist attacks in London and Madrid. Think the French and Dutch referendums on the European Constitutional Treaty. Think the first emergence of the Kaczynski twins in Poland. And then, of course, in 2007, Vladimir Putin declares war on the West at the Munich Security Conference. But it's really in 2008 that the downward turn becomes evident, with the simultaneous developments of the global financial crisis and Vladimir Putin's seizure of 2 parts of the territory of Georgia. From that time forward, it has been one crisis after another. we in Europe have been like a boxer on the ropes, getting hit left, right, left, right. Eurozone crisis. Hungary starting in 2010, the dismantling of democracy by Viktor Orban. 2014, the seizure of Crimea and the beginning of a low-level armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, which continued ever since. It wasn't the beginning of the war in Europe in Ukraine on the 24th of February. The refugee and migration crisis, 2015-2016, Poland beginning to emulate Hungary from 2015 onwards, Brexit in 2016, the election of Donald Trump, coming to power in 2017, the COVID pandemic, and then, of course, starting on the 24th of February 2022, a full-scale war in Ukraine with the combined economic consequences of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine being still becoming apparent, but certainly are part of the explanation of the extremely worrying Italian election result just a few days ago. Now, as with the upward turn, so now with the downward turn, these quite distinct developments, each of them having their own etiology, their own causes and character, become mutually reinforcing. So, for example, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, starts life as an anti-Euro party, but then converts itself in the refugee and migration crisis to an anti-immigration party, and with that scores its extraordinary electoral success, becoming in fact the leading opposition party in the Bundestag. Or to give another example, the Daily Mail, a paper I'm sure all of you read religiously, hugely influential in this country. The Daily Mail, in its leader the day before the referendum, urging people to vote for Brexit, mentions both the refugee and migration crisis on the continent as an example of what might happen here, and interestingly, the Eurozone crisis. The Daily Mail mentions youth unemployment in Southern Europe as an example of why we need to get out of the European Union. Brexiteers praise Trump, Trump praises Brexit. Matteo Salvini, Marine Le Pen, and indeed in her day, Giorgia Meloni praise Putin, and Putin not just praises, but in various ways, partly by finance and partly by disinformation, supports populist parties. The COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine mutually reinforce the economic crisis we face. So that just as you had the upward spiral from 1985 and then gathering strength from 1989, you now have the downward spiral starting roughly in 2005 and continuing with strength ever since 2008. Now, each of those developments really requires a richer, more granular analysis. But I'm just going to single out one, because in light of where we are with the war in Ukraine, this is obviously the most directly relevant. It seems to me fair to say that 2014 is the turning point at which the West failed to turn. The relative lack of response to the violation of the most fundamental taboo of post-1945 Europe, of the never again Europe, of liberal international order, which is frontiers are only changed by peaceful means and with mutual consent. The relative lack of a forceful response to that. Yes, there were sanctions, but nothing of a scale concomitant with the challenge. And indeed, the fact that far from hurrying at that point to reduce our energy dependency on Russia, some European countries became more dependent on Russia for energy. Let me remind you that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which has just had some holes blown in it, was actually built entirely after 2014. The agreement was signed and it was built after 2014. And underlying this, I think again there is a historical misreading. So the great German intellectual historian Reinhard Koselleck has a wonderful essay on the unknown future and the art of prognosis. And he says that one of the things we can do is to learn from recurrent patterns in history, recurrent patterns. And of course, one of the recurrent patterns is quite simply that great imperial powers don't give up their empires without a struggle. And so to believe that one of the largest land empires, in fact, the largest land empire in Europe, surviving land empire in Europe, the Russian Empire, Soviet Russian Empire, had softly and suddenly vanished away between 1989 and 1991, and that was the end of it, was a really dangerous illusion. I met Vladimir Putin in 1994. He was then the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. No one had heard of him. We were at a conference in St. Petersburg, a Russian West conference, and there was this peculiar little, rather unpleasant-looking, rat-faced man sitting at the end of the table, who was some sort of sidekick of the mayor. Nobody took any notice. And then towards the end of the conference, he piped up and he said with great passion, "We have to remember that there are historic territories that have always been Russian, which are now outside the Russian Federation." And he specifically mentioned Crimea. And he said there are 25 million Russians outside the territory of the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation has a duty of care towards them. 1994, 5 years before the first NATO enlargement. We can talk about NATO enlargement, but don't tell me that NATO enlargement was the primary cause of this reaction. And there is, in a sense, a direct line from that already present post-imperial revanchist sentiment to what he did yesterday in the annexation, the totally illegitimate annexation of the 4 territories of Ukraine. Of course, the story is more complicated than that. There's much more that happens in between. In particular, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine had a huge impact on Putin, the sense that a democracy was coming closer to his front door. So the empire started to strike back in 2008. It struck back with fourth in 2014. And because the West failed to turn, we went all the way back on the 24th of February, 2022. We had said never again. It happened again in former Yugoslavia. We said never again, and now it happened again. On the very territory where between 1941 and 1944, Nazi Germany, the Wehrmacht and the SS, fought a war of terror. Now the Russian forces again fought a war of terror. The same cities, the same towns, the same villages, sometimes even the same people. Boris Romanchenko, a Ukrainian who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, killed by a Russian missile in Kharkiv. Babin Yar, the site of the Babin Yar massacre, struck by a Russian missile. Half the Jewish population forced to flee. Old men and women in Ukraine talking about the Russian invaders, talked about them to Ukrainian reporters as Nimtsi, Germans, because that's how they thought about them, the barbaric invaders of the Germans. And that unbelievably poignant picture of the dead civilian woman on the street in Irpin with her hand outstretched in the mud, and just beyond it, some of you will have seen it, the keyring with on the pendant of the keyring, the flag of the European Union. Never again, we had said, we won't go back, and we have gone all the way back in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, when people say after the war, they won't mean after 1945. They'll mean after this war. Now, periodization is always a debatable art. So some might argue that what I call the post-war period really comes to an end already in 2008. But I think there is a sense in which it really comes to an end in 2022, because what we're seeing now is truly full circle. What didn't happen in 1991, when, let me remind you, there was an attempted coup in Moscow. There was an attempt already, but it failed. If it had succeeded, you would have seen already the empire striking back. Happens 30 years later in 2022. Certainly, it's the end of some of the illusions of the post-war period. The post-war period is a bit more complicated. In one sense, the post-war period ended in 1990-91 because the state system we have today is essentially a product of the treaty work of 1990-91, with some new states emerging obviously later. On the other hand, the institutions, the key institutions we have today, not just NATO, but the EU as a successor to the European Community, the Council of Europe, the Bretton Woods institution, the UN, are the post-war institutions. So in that sense, we're still in the post-war period. But I think there's a third sense in which we might say the post-war period is coming to an end now. It is that sense that Europe had moved beyond war and therefore need not really worry too much about the military dimension of power. Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen. Remember that? Create peace without weapons. And we're waking up, I think, to the inadequacy of that. Olaf Scholz coined the famous term, Zeitenwende. Now, of course, I'm not going to suggest that the war in Ukraine is as large an event in European history as the Second World War. That would be ridiculous. And that in that sense, we're back in a post-war period. But I think we are now in a new period, emerging from the war in Ukraine, a period which still has no name and whose character we still don't know. Now, as a historian, I could just stop there. But you all want to know about the future. It's the fate of historians always to be asked about the future. So let me just float ahead in imagination for a moment to the 60th anniversary of the Europaeum in 2052, which many of you will live to see. I'm not sure if one or two of us will, but you will live to see, and say just three quick things in conclusion on how we thinking about approaching this future. The first is very simple. If history teaches us anything, it is that we don't know what's going to happen later this evening, let alone in a few years' time. But what we can do is to make intelligent, historically informed guesses about the likely patterns of developments. This was Koselleck's point, and makes our strategic action on the basis of that historically informed guesswork. And in doing that, a great motto is the one popularized by Antonio Gramsci: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So politicians have to have a professional optimism. Some might say we had a little bit of it from Ursula von der Leyen at the beginning of this meeting in the nicest possible way. We have a brilliant example of it, of that professional optimism, from the incredibly impressive way in which the current economic policy of the British government is being presented by our Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer. But we at universities don't need to do that. Our job is to seek the truth and to tell it wherever it's found. And actually, intellectual pessimism can be an entirely constructive phenomenon. One reason we got to the upward turn of the 1980s was that there was a remorseless, intellectually pessimistic analysis of what had gone wrong in the 1970s. Compare and contrast the ill-founded intellectual optimism of the early 2000s, and look where that got us. And the reasons for pessimism are not so much inside Europe as externally. If we look around Europe, you see the challenge of climate change. One little figure. In the 50 years since the early 1970s, our planet has warmed 0.5 degrees, more than in the entire 11,000 years from the end of the last ice age to 1900. Another figure, demography. 50 years ago, the population of the planet was about 4 billion. Now it's 8 billion, going on up. Russia, we talked about. China, a Leninist capitalist superpower, eyeing Taiwan as Russia once eyed Crimea. Nairi Woods this morning made the very good point that we shouldn't naively believe that because countries are democracies, they're necessarily going to be on our side. The Ukraine war has showed us that major democracies, India, Brazil, South Africa, are actually on the other side. And of course, the crisis of American democracy and the relative decline of the United States, so that after 2024, we may not be able to count on the United States as we have for the most part up till now. But against that, and this is my penultimate point, I want to say that inside Europe, and particularly inside the European Union, most of the achievement of the post-1945 and post-1989 periods is still intact. If you're a young European with enough money, you can wake up on a Friday morning, decide on impulse to take a budget flight to the other end of the continent. If you fall in love with the place or someone there, you can settle down, work, study, and live there. From Helsinki to Athens, from Lisbon to Tallinn, or indeed Tartu. And you will, as long as you don't land in Hungary, be in a democracy, and a democracy which will be in the same political security and economic communities. There has never been a time in European history. We've never had a Europe like that. With all due caveats, this is, to adapt Churchill, the worst possible Europe, apart from all the other Europes that have been tried from time to time. And it is worth defending, preserving, and conserving. And if we simply managed to conserve and to a limited degree extend this Europe at the current level of integration, we would be doing very well, right? We don't need constantly to derive the legitimacy of the European project from a telos, from some future ideal state. We had to do that at the beginning because there was nothing there, we had to build it. But now there is a small c conservative argument for defending and extending and improving the European Union, which of course, with the famous De Lampedusa motto, means things must change so they can remain the same. And of course, we have the external challenges. How we do that is up to us, and particularly up to you. And if anyone is going to take that task on, it is this fantastic trans-European elite that we have in the alumni of the Europaeum. So in that spirit, let me leave you with a final thought from one of the greatest Europeans of the period I've been talking about, Václav Havel. Václav Havel, in his own version of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, said this, I quote, "Hope is not prognostication. It's an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. Hope is an ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out." End of quotation. Defending, improving, and extending a free Europe makes sense. It's a cause worthy of hope. Thank you very much.